Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do: to educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade, Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome to today's show, and today's topic is on stress. Now, obviously, this is a very big topic. It is one that I would say is very misunderstood, and I want to cover as much of this as I possibly can. Now, let's frame this up, because there's a difference between emotional stress and metabolic stress. Now, of course, all emotional stress is also metabolic stress, but you can have metabolic stress without feeling any emotional state. In other words, most people think stress has got to come along with an emotional state of anxiety or depression or some kind of emotional angst. And the truth is, you can have an awful lot of metabolic stress going on and be incredibly happy. And so the first thing that I want us all to kind of understand and agree upon is that emotional stress is a very tiny component of stress. And in fact, it may not be the most important type of stress when we're talking about the metabolism. So this discussion is going to be around helping us understand how to deal with stress. Now, I oftentimes talk about the metabolism as a stress barometer. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that the metabolism, in its simplest form, as we talk about it and try to make it as simple as we can, which we really shouldn't do with something that complex, but in its simplest form, it is simply a sensing and responding apparatus. So what is it sensing? Well, it's sensing stress. It is responding to stress. So when we talk about stress from the metabolic point of view or from the metabolism point of view, the metabolism sees anything that throws it out of balance or homeostasis. Homeostasis is just a term, for those of you who don't know, that we use in science to talk about returning to balance. So the body metabolism is always trying to return to balance or homeostasis. So anything that knocks the metabolism out of balance is a stress. So this could be a change in temperature, where you walk outside and it's cold or it's hot and your body starts to get really cool really fast or get hot really fast, and then it has to institute something to get it back to balance. For example, maybe it'll start sweating to cool the body, or maybe it will start shivering to heat the body. So temperature changes can certainly cause a stress, knocking the metabolism out of balance and forcing it to respond. It could be changes in activity level, right? If you've been a sitter for the last month and then all of a sudden you start doing 20-mile hikes, that's going to be pretty severe stress to the metabolism. It's going to be a stress on the joints. It's going to be a stress on the muscles. It's going to be a stress on the energy systems. It's going to be something that throws the metabolism out of balance that it will have to respond to. So changes in fuel availability as well, how much food is available and how much nutrients are in that food. So any kind of discrepancy in energy use around food can be a stress. Too little food, too much food, too little nutrients, too much nutrient. Either side of this. And the way that you should be thinking about stress is about this Goldilocks zone. So in other words, if we're talking about balance, that means anything that is too much or too little can be a stress to the metabolism. And this is why I oftentimes talk about the gap between calorie and nutrient intake and calorie and nutrient use or output in terms of what we're eating and consuming versus how much we're using. This can be a significant stress, and perhaps, in my mind, one of the most salient stresses that we need to really pay attention to if we want to look good, feel good, function better, and live longer. Now, a couple other really big stresses historically for humans are infection and injury, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. Now, obviously, emotional stress. Yes, this is a stress, but you're starting to see it is a very small component of stress in the big scheme of things. Also, another stress is changes in connection and support. One of the things you need to understand about humans, and I think we all do, but I'm just going to point it out to us, is that we are not islands unto ourselves. Humans are built for connection, cooperation. We can't survive alone. In fact, we would not be having this discussion right now if it weren't for tribes. Humans going at it alone would have never made it this far. So whenever we are ostracized from our community or seen as bad by our fellow humans, or shamed in any way, or feel guilty, or feel like we are being singled out and don't have support or friends and family that have our backs, these are very significant forms of stress. And this also is a very historical form of stress that we'll talk about here in a minute. Changes in sleep or changes in any type of recovery. We humans need to have a balance between output and recovery. And we often don't think about this. And any threat to our survival is a stress. And the key here is whether it is perceived or real. In other words, if we perceive the world is out to get us, even if it isn't, this adds to our stress burden. Now, when we talk about metabolic stress in a historical context, the biggest stressors for the metabolism were starvation, injury, infection, and rejection by our tribe or being ostracized by our tribe. These are four really big ones for stress in my mind. You can think about these as the prime directives for the metabolism. Starvation being a key one. The whole point of the metabolism is to keep us alive long enough for us to reproduce and spread our genes. So starvation is a big one. And the way to think about the way the metabolism works regarding stress is almost like survival software. So whenever, let's say, if we view our metabolism like a computer and we run into any of these stresses, starvation, injury, infection, rejection, anything like that, then a particular software program is run to try to get the metabolism back to balance. Now, starvation is a huge one. And one of the things that oftentimes happens here when you can look at stress in a historical context is that as the metabolism evolved over hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years, if we talk about humans being evolved from other species, we all of the species that we are descendants from, in a sense, have the same stress software. And the most salient stress software is the starvation software. And so in a very real sense, I like to think about this is that anytime the metabolism runs into stress, real or perceived, even if it's not starvation, it will oftentimes institute the starvation response. And so we want to talk a little bit here about what is the starvation response. What does the metabolism do when it senses stress, in particular starvation type of stress? Well, what it will do is it will create hunger, right? Well, if you're starving, you need to have motivation to go find food. The last thing you want to do if you are starving is sit in your cave and not go look for food. So the metabolism will make you more hungry as a motivational impetus to go and get food. It will also perhaps trigger cravings for highly palatable foods that are richer in calories, so it doesn't have to go and eat and search for food over and over again. The more calories it could get at each meal, the better off the metabolism would be in terms of a starvation response. So hunger and cravings are uniquely linked to the starvation response and uniquely linked to stress. So hopefully you're getting the point here already of like, okay, well, if I can't control hunger and cravings, then they must be a big piece of the stress software. When I'm having constant hunger and or constant cravings, it must be a hint to me that my body is under stress, that my metabolism is under stress. Hunger and cravings are a big one. Now, also, mood and motivation, especially the motivational component of mood, is a big one as well. Because once again, if you are starving or undergoing stress, you need to be motivated. The mood has got to change in a way that motivates you to go get food. And so oftentimes you'll see changes in mood, maybe anxiety, right? To be like, oh my gosh, and get worried and I got to go find food. Maybe depression, to slow everything down, including brain function if we're not getting enough fuel. And almost a back and forth here. So you can kind of think of the metabolism as both trying to conserve at times so it doesn't use up too much of its existing reserves and energy needs, energy storage and nutrient needs, but also at other times making the body brain more motivated and anxious to go out and find food. And so oftentimes you'll see this unpredictable, unstable energy and motivation, fluctuating moods and fluctuating energy, at times forcing us to get up and get out and go find food, and at other times slowing everything down and forcing us to relax and conserve energy. And so you see a lot of this. You'll oftentimes see changes in sleep as well, where sleep will become fragmented, it will become shorter, it will become and you can think about this, like you can imagine like what it would feel like if you were worried about something coming and getting you in the middle of the night, you know, like the boogeyman or a lion or, you know, being attacked or something like that. Your sleep would probably be light, fragmented. You would probably be waking up again and again and again. And this is the same thing that happens in the starvation response as well. And this is one of the reasons I oftentimes talk about the idea of sleep, hunger, mood, energy, and cravings, or S.H.M.E.C. When we think about sleep, hunger, mood, energy, and cravings, or hunger, energy, and cravings, S.H.M.E.C and HEC, these acronyms that I use all the time that many of you, most of you who listen to this podcast can repeat, sort of verbatim and by memory because you've heard it so much. But these responses to stress are part of the survival software that the metabolism institutes when it is under stress. And so whenever you have fragmented, light, difficult sleep, whenever you have fluctuating moods, anxiety, and depression, whenever you have unpredictable, unstable energy, whenever hunger is insatiable and out of control, or cravings are insatiable and out of control, then you can be assured that in some way, shape, or form, your metabolism is feeling like it is under stress. This is very important for us to know because, like we've talked about, the metabolism does not speak English or French or Spanish. It speaks metabolism. And if you want to understand what the metabolism is telling you, you're going to want to understand the biofeedback signals that it is sending. And one of the earliest biofeedback signals that it will send when it is under stress has to do with changes in sleep, hunger, mood, energy, and cravings. And really, the first stressful response is really going to come in hunger, energy, and cravings. And then as the stress continues, sleep and mood will change. And I oftentimes talk about this idea of S.H.M.E.C, sleep, hunger, mood, energy, and cravings, representing, obviously, sleep, hunger, mood, energy, and cravings, but also being a catch-all phrase or a catch-all acronym for all biofeedback sensations. So it's not just sleep, hunger, mood, energy, and cravings that can tell us about metabolic stress, but it's also exercise recovery. Are you recovering or not from exercise? Are your joints sore and remaining sore? Are your muscles recovering? Is your exercise performance improving or staying the same, or is it declining? Declining exercise performance as well as prolonged exercise recovery are key indications that you are overreaching, overtraining, or being subjected to too much stress and not being able to respond to that. You'll also see with stress a very big indicator in the digestive tract. Now, one of the things about the digestive tract is that it is responsive to parasympathetic output in the nervous system. So remember, there are two major aspects of the nervous system. There is the sympathetic nervous system, what we call the fight, flight, or freeze responses. Whenever you're under threat, oftentimes you will release adrenaline and noradrenaline to help you fight or flee, and sometimes make you freeze and not move. And this is a survival response. And whenever you are in sympathetic mode, parasympathetic mode, which is rest and digest function, begins to decline a little bit. And so the two, it's like a switch. You're either in sympathetic mode and parasympathetic mode is off, or you're in parasympathetic mode and sympathetic mode is off. Now, of course, it's not that simple because they're both running sort of all of the time. But in general, you can see that the digestive system, the rest and digest system, if the sympathetic nervous system is in high drive all the time, you will see many changes in digestive function. In fact, you see immunoglobulin A, which is a immunoglobulin that the immune system uses as part of its innate immune response to help the mucous membranes lining the lungs and the mucous membranes of the mouth and the gut lining to be resistant to infectious agents. You also see the gut lining, the mucosal lining, degrade a little bit with chronic stress. You'll also see pancreatic enzyme secretion decrease. And so what you'll end up finding is that your digestive capacity is much worse. Either you'll suffer from constipation and or diarrhea, oftentimes both. You may find increased transit time in the gut or decreased transit time. So you might see that you're getting loose stools and diarrhea, or you're getting sort of hardened, dried stools and or constipation. And so with stress, you will see many different changes in the digestive function as well. And of course, you can also see changes in any signs or symptoms. For example, if you're someone who tends to get headaches, migraines, things like that, you might see that increase in duration and or severity as your stress levels increase. If you tend to get joint pain, you might see those joint pains increase in severity or in duration when your stress increases. You may see any other number of signs and symptoms as it relates to stress. Now, the more the stress is, the more chronic it is, the longer lasting it is, the deeper you go into some of this biofeedback dysfunction. One of the other ones is obviously, like we talked about before, the metabolism's whole job is to keep you alive long enough to reproduce. Well, when the body is under stress, any kind of stress for a prolonged period of time, survival takes priority and reproduction takes a back seat. And this is why you'll oftentimes see with people who are very low body fat percent, in other words, a starvation response or someone under severe stress, that you'll see libido go down or go away completely. If you're a man, you'll see your erections decrease and your desire for sex decrease. With women, you might lose menses. And so you'll see an awful lot going on in the reproductive realm as well. Now, this is oftentimes one of the last things to go, but usually when you think about stress and how deep-seated it is, you'll normally see hunger, energy, and cravings as the first thing. Then you'll see sleep and mood added on to that. HEC goes out of check first, then S.H.M.E.C goes out of check next. Then you'll start seeing decrements in exercise performance and exercise recovery. And then you'll begin to see changes in libido, menses, erection, and then, of course, signs and symptoms. And you may even get diagnosed with a disease. And this is why I oftentimes talk about these stages of metabolic damage, for lack of a better term. What else is a disease if not metabolic damage after all? So when I think of metabolic damage, I'm actually thinking more of metabolic disease. But there's several different ways to think about this. Stage 1 of this metabolic damage or disease is going to be what we call metabolic compensation. This is the early warning signs of stress. And usually here you're going to see hunger, energy, and cravings beginning to kick up a little bit. And if you're trying to diet through eat less, exercise more, you may actually see that the hunger and cravings increase your calorie intake to the degree that your any weight loss or fat loss will stall. And obviously energy will begin to be unpredictable and unstable. Now, if you keep pushing on the metabolism, then oftentimes you'll see sleep and mood become an issue as well as some metabolic decline in terms of thyroid output and resting metabolic rate and other signs and symptoms. So here we call this metabolic resistance, or I should say I call this metabolic resistance, stage 2 of sort of this metabolic damage or metabolic disease. Stage 3 of this is really what I would call metabolic dysfunction. At this point, you begin to see changes in the hypothalamus pituitary communication with the thyroid, the adrenals, and the gonads. And so here you begin to see some of the other things that we see. Exercise performance, exercise recovery starts being problematic. You also will start to see libido, menses, and erection issues beginning to crop up around this time. And if the stress continues, you may actually end up with metabolic disease, which would be, maybe a diagnosis of hypothyroid or a diagnosis of polycystic ovarian syndrome or a diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis. And oftentimes these will be diagnoses of autoimmune conditions because stress wreaks havoc on the ability of the immune system to do its job and function appropriately. So oftentimes that is one of the first things that becomes dysfunctional. And you will also begin to see increased susceptibility to infectious agents around this time as well. And so not just hunger, energy, and cravings in stage 1 or sleep, hunger, mood, energy, and cravings in stage 2, but also exercise performance, exercise recovery, libido issues, menses issues, erection issues in stage 3, and then increased susceptibility to infection in stage 3, going into stage 4, metabolic disease, where you start to look at getting diagnosed with an actual condition. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is because many people think that health is really just about what we are eating and how we are exercising. But what a lot of people do not understand is that eating and exercise, too much food or too little food, too much exercise or too little exercise, becomes a major source of stress for the metabolism. And when we're talking about sort of this starvation response, it is a good way to think about it because in a very real sense, any type of stress that the metabolism is under will to some degree, some way, shape, or form resemble the starvation software. Hunger, energy, craving, sleep, mood, exercise performance, exercise recovery, libido, and all these things can begin to go out of check. So let's talk a little bit then about how we begin to manage some of this stress. Now, again, please remember, we're not talking just about emotional stress here. In fact, emotional stress is a very small component of this. But when we talk about diet and exercise, because obviously there's all kinds of stress that we can talk about, I'm going to focus on diet and exercise stress here. When we think about stress, there's several different ways to think about it. First of all, and this is where it gets confusing, there is a good form of stress. If there was no stress at all, your metabolism would have nothing to challenge it, to make it adapt and get stronger. And so we call this stress that is not prolonged or super intense, but is enough but not too much stress as eustress. Eustress or adaptation stress. It is enough stress that the body then gets stronger. And exercise done in the Goldilocks zone, not too much, not too little, but just right, is a eustress. Now, exercise that is too little, not enough movement, or too much is a stress. is a negative stress. So yes, exercise that is enough and not too much is a positive stress. Exercise that is not enough or too much is a negative stress. Same thing with food, both food calories and food nutrients. Too much, too little is a negative stress. Just right is a positive stress. Same goes for some thermal exposures, right? Right now, there's a rash of research coming out on cold exposure and thermal exposures through cold acclimation and heat acclimation and contrasting, hot with cold. Well, a short-term cold exposure is incredibly advantageous and a good adaptation response when it is enough but not too much. Obviously, too much cold can kill you. Obviously, sitting in 72 degrees constantly gives you no thermal challenge whatsoever, and that's not going to be healthy for you either. So some degree of cold exposure helps us adapt, and research has shown it helps our immune system function better. It helps our metabolism function better. It makes us more flexible, more resilient, and more resistant to other stresses. Same thing with hot exposures. Getting exposed to heat, forcing our body to sweat. As long as that heat is not too much, obviously too much heat can kill us. But then again, never having heat at all and always sitting in 72 degrees room temperature doesn't give us some of the advantages that heat would give us either. Sorry to break in. I want to cover one of my sponsors, Organifi. Now, look, I'm a little embarrassed to admit this, and many of you who know me well know this, but shockingly, I cannot stand vegetables. I really do not like vegetables. I have not liked them since a child. I think it has something to do with my mom, who cooked everything just boiled everything, no salt, no fat, no taste, period. And so I developed an extreme dislike for almost all vegetables. And still to this day, I have a difficult time getting in my fruits and vegetables. Well, Organifi, started by my good friend Drew Canoli, who I've developed a relationship over the years, and I am really sort of tickled that we finally get to do this together with Organifi sponsoring the Next Level Human podcast. Drew is a next level human. Organifi is a next level human company. I can't say enough about them. I'm excited for them to be on board as a sponsor for the Next Level Human podcast. My favorite products, let me tell you about them. They have a ton, but I use 3 pretty much every day. I use Organifi Gold before I go to sleep. This is their turmeric tea based on sort of the old Ayurvedic golden milk. It is absolutely fantastic. It contains lots of different relaxing herbs, turmeric, tastes wonderful. And one of the things this has done for me is I had a very bad wine habit at night. It started out as just 1 glass of wine. Lately, it's turned into 2, 3, and sometimes a bottle. What I've done, starting in 2021, is use Organifi. This is what I have in lieu of wine, and I sit there just like I used to sit with my wine, and I have the Organifi Gold. I also use the green and red juice powders. I have never liked greens and reds juices, period. These powders to me always tasted like swamp water. I use 1 scoop of the greens, 1 scoop of the reds first thing in the morning before my coffee. It has become a ritual over the last several years. It is fantastic. Those are the ones I use the most. Of course, they have a great line of protein products, and they have a new Organifi Gold chocolate, which I have not tried yet, but I cannot wait to try that because you all know I love cocoa powder and use it for lots of different things, for cravings and everything else. Check out Organifi, Organifi.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. Please take care of Organifi the same way they're taking care of the earth, doing amazing things as a company, and now taking care of the Next Level Human podcast so we can all be together and have these discussions. Organifi.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. I want to ask you a question. If you had to follow your friends around who are not the healthiest in the world and see what they are doing, what would be the number one thing you would probably tell them to do to start? For most people, that's going to be drinking more water, right? This is something that we talk about all the time in health and fitness. It's almost as if we think of it as an afterthought now because obviously water is so crucial. However, we oftentimes get this wrong. For example, did you know that when it comes to hydration, just drinking water can make things worse. Most people don't know this. Why? Partly because most people are over drinking water and under consuming the electrolytes that help water do its job. What we don't realize is that hydration is not just about water. It's about electrolytes, the minerals in there, as well as getting that water into the cells. And so you do not want to be over consuming water if you're not getting your electrolytes right. And this opens up a whole new discussion because most people are not getting their electrolytes right. For example, did you know that low sodium, too low sodium, is an issue? Just as much, if not more so, than high sodium. In other words, what we want if we're going to get the right electrolytes is to get the right amount of sodium and potassium and magnesium in the Goldilocks zone. We don't want too much. We don't want too little. We want it just right. This opens up a whole other thing here too, because people who are exercising, doing sauna therapies, doing low-carb diets are disrupting and losing lots and lots of their electrolytes. For example, when insulin is not around in low-carb diets, you will excrete lots of sodium. In other words, under that state, exercising, low-carb diets, all these things, you actually need more sodium. And so if you're somebody who's been just drinking water, not paying attention to electrolytes, and also feeling fatigued, feeling like you're underperforming, not sleeping right, getting cramps, twitches, headaches, any of these things, then you are probably dealing with an electrolyte issue. This is where the product Element comes in. This product has been a game changer for me and many of my patients and clients. This is a rehydration electrolyte beverage, basically. It is a powder of electrolytes formulated with 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams magnesium without the added sugar and other nonsense that comes in beverages like Gatorade. This stuff is basically a rehydration beverage on steroids. It is the thing that is going to replenish your electrolytes in the right ratios, decrease fatigue, really correct chronic dehydration. And by the way, many people are dehydrating themselves, becoming hyponatremic, low sodium, when they're consuming too much water. You need your electrolytes on board, especially if you are someone who is losing lots of sodium and other electrolytes through low-carb diets and lots of exercise. This is where Element comes in. Element is a new sponsor to the Next Level Human podcast. I cannot recommend this product enough. I have been using this stuff for months now, and I have immediately seen changes in my energy levels. I feel like I'm operating on a whole other level, and I have seen this as being the primary thing that people who have been using Element have been telling me, that their fatigue is getting better, especially fatigue that comes after very intense workouts that involve lots of sweating and lots of intense output from the nervous system. Please check out Element. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. DrinkElement.com. That's DrinkLMNT.com. DrinkElement.com, and let's get back to the show. Of course, the same thing happens with exercise. Some ballistic movement, some stress and strain on the joints, some, mechanical strain on the muscle, some metabolic buildup of metabolic byproducts through intense exercise. Some of that helps us adapt and get better. Too much of it or too little can be overly stressful. And so when you think about these kinds of stresses, what you want to be thinking about is several different forms. There is short, intense stress. There is prolonged, mild stress. There is long, intense stress. And there is long, moderate stress. Now, when we think about exercise and diet, short, intense stress would be from an exercise perspective, this would be like a 15 to 20 minute super intense, high intensity interval or CrossFit sort of metabolic conditioning type of workout, sprint training or something like that, something that gets you breathless, something that makes your body burn, something that is extremely difficult to do, but it's short-lived. And in that case, because it's intense, that would be stressful if it was prolonged, but the fact that it is short is a very good thing to the body. And so short, intense stress seems to be adaptive, seems to be positive for us. Also, very prolonged but very mild stress, like very long, slow walking, also seems to be adaptive and positive in its stress response. And by the way, here's how we know. I'll break a little bit of this biochemistry down for you. There's two ways to look at this. And both of them have to do with sort of the body's response to the stress hormone cortisol. So if we do short, intense stress or exercise, something like interval training, or short, intense stress with diet, something like fasting for, 24 to 48 hours, a very short fast, what will end up happening is cortisol will rise a little bit. But in response, also, growth hormone will also rise as well. And so this idea of growth hormone combining with cortisol, the two work synergistically to help you adapt, to get stronger, to actually burn fat, believe it or not. However, as things progress and get longer and longer, as that fast continues or as the exercise gets longer and longer, what happens is cortisol starts to dominate and become dysfunctional and outpaces human growth hormone and testosterone, which are these hormones that buffer against cortisol. And not just buffer against cortisol, but actually help cortisol work with the body rather than against the body. So short, intense exercise or short, intense dietary extremes can be highly beneficial hormonally. That is the type of stress that we want. Think about being out on the plains of Africa. A lion jumps out at you and your tribe. You run as fast as you can or you fight. It's very short-lived. Either you're going to get away pretty quickly or you are going to fight and win or fight and die. But if you fight and win or you run away, what ends up happening is during the fighting process, you have a flood of stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, all these hormones basically are elicited to increase heart rate, to dilate the bronchioles in the lungs, to essentially liberate sugar and fat stores. And then the intense exercise and the intense activity that is coupled with that stressful response, muscles moving, muscles burning, muscles straining, this super intense output. Not only do you use up all the fat and sugar that the body released, but you also release a host of other chemicals, testosterone and human growth hormone and myokines like IL-6 and IL-8 and IL-15 and all these other sort of adaptation responses in the muscle that then, once you stop the fight or the flee, work to go, okay, we need to build ourselves back better, stronger, faster. Many of these compounds rebuild muscle stronger or increase ligament and tendon strength or do any number of things to make the body get better. And so when you think about these stressful responses, you want them to be short-lived and intense to combine this cortisol stress hormone response with this adaptation response with other hormones like human growth hormone and testosterone. And so short fasts do that. Short, intense exercise does that. Now, another way that you could do this is just very short or long, but relaxed type of activity. In this case, you don't get the growth hormone responses, but you do get a very relaxing response where cortisol levels will fall and the body will sensitize itself to insulin in a sense. And so really when we think about managing stress in terms of activity, we want either short, intense activity or very relaxing, long activity. Same goes for food. If we're going to have decreased nutrients or decreased calories, fasting or not eating a lot, we do not want that to last long. A few days, maybe a week, depending on how extreme it is. The more extreme it is, if you're fasting, you don't want it really to go past a day or two. Now, the example of going low and slow with that would be being in an isocaloric state or matching calories fairly closely. So having a 500 calorie deficit would be relatively stressful for the body. And my reading of the research says that once you get beyond about 30% calorie deficit, you're starting to get into perhaps the extreme, more extreme prolonged type of stress response. So the equivalent to walking nice and relaxed from a diet perspective would be being in a narrow calorie gap. In other words, the amount that you're eating and the amount that you're putting out in energy is relatively close together, within 100 or 200 calories, right? But not, 300, 400, or 500 calories. Now, of course, it's the long moderate stress or the long intense stress that is really difficult, right? So if you're going to go and run a marathon, let's say, that is a very long, intense stress. If you're going to do a 500 calorie deficit diet for 12 weeks, that's a very long, intense stress. If you're going to go run for, jog for an hour or 90 minutes, that is a long, moderate stress. With those kinds of things, cortisol begins to dominate, and the adaptation hormones of growth hormone and testosterone and all these other things do not pick up to help you adapt. And so you really want to be thinking about, if you're going to go to extremes, those extremes should be short-lived. Otherwise, you should always live in a very balanced, relaxed state. And you want to avoid long, intense stress and long, moderate stress. Now, you might say, well, Jade, I know plenty of people who do very long jogging and things like that, and it doesn't seem stressful to their body. Or you might say, I know athletes do an extreme amount of activity, and that doesn't seem to be stressful for them. I don't see them having issues with hunger, energy, and cravings, and sleep and mood and things like that. And what you're missing is the fact that most of those people who are doing that have either conditioned themselves slowly to get there, they've adapted and slowly gotten there, but they are almost always in a narrow calorie gap. In other words, they are very rarely, if ever, for short periods of time, in an eat less, exercise more extreme state. They're almost always in either an eat less, exercise less state where the calorie gap is narrow, or an eat more, exercise more state where the calorie gap is narrow. And this is very, very important to deal with stress. It's extremely important. So hopefully you're starting to understand this idea of stress that is negative versus stress that is positive, eustress, and some of the adaptation responses, and how short, intense stress, as well as prolonged, gentle stress, both can have an adaptation response that is beneficial, whereas prolonged, intense stress or very long, moderate stress can turn to a chronic, negative stress and lead to issues. Now, we've already covered how you would know. You'll know based on sleep, hunger, mood, energy, and cravings, and all the other biofeedback. This is how you want to be thinking about this. Now, we also have other ways that we can look at this. We, for example, can look at the way our body feels around soreness, around digestive function, around the ability to perform and to continue to perform. So we just talked about that, these biofeedback sensations. But we also now have ways to measure our body's response to stress that may give us a little bit more of an early warning sign. For example, we can look at heart rate. When the physiology is under stress, heart rate, resting heart rate doesn't lower as much as it would otherwise. And so you will find that your heart rate while you're sleeping doesn't go down as low as it normally does. Or when you are relaxing, your heart rate is slightly elevated. So if you knew what your average heart rate was while you were sleeping, and you knew what your resting heart rate usually is when you're relaxing, and you saw trends of that kicking up a little bit, this could be a very early warning sign that you are under stress. You can even use this in exercise. With exercise, if you do an extreme bout of exercise, let's say you go all out for 1 minute, and then you measure your heart rate response, before you start that 1 minute sprint, you'll have a resting heart rate, let's say of 60 or 65 or 70. And when you do that minute burst, let's say it's going to be a minute of burpees as fast as you can, you'll see your heart rate go up by huge amounts. Maybe it'll go up to 140, 150, even 160. Now, the right response, the healthy response, a resilient response, a response by a metabolism that is not overwhelmed with that stress, is for your heart rate to drop at least 20 beats within the next minute. So if you did these burpees for a minute and you measured your heart rate before, and then you measured it right after, and then you saw how fast it took for your body to get back to 20 beats below its peak, that would tell you how resilient your body is. Now, if you kept doing that, if you did a second bout and a third bout and a fourth bout, what you would eventually find is that your heart rate would eventually get to a point where it would not drop at least 20 beats per minute. And that would be a good period of time for you to end that workout. In fact, I have used this in my clinical practice with people who have chronic fatigue syndrome, what we would call, for lack of a better term, adrenal fatigue, basically people who are dealing with metabolic resistance or metabolic dysfunction, where the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal, thyroid, and gonadal axes are being challenged. You will see that the sympathetic drive is not being counteracted by the parasympathetic drive, and you will see heart rate remain elevated for prolonged periods of time. And often with these people, I used that to essentially tell when the workout will end. Instead of giving them 20 minutes of high intensity or interval training, I would just basically say, do a minute of intervals and then a minute of rest, and measure your heart rate response, your heart rate recovery. If your heart rate recovery stops being able to recover within 20 beats within a minute, you need to stop that workout. And this is a very good way for them to keep themselves from overdoing it. Another great way to do this, by the way, is to institute just nasal breathing. When you use nasal breathing, it is a really good way to force the body not to overexert itself, because the nasal breathing limits the amount of oxygen you can get in the body and limits the intensity that you can go. One of the other things that's great about nasal breathing as it relates to stress is that you create a lot of nitric oxide in the nasal passages, and you also build up your CO2 tolerance. A lot of people don't realize that it's CO2 that the body is measuring, and you have to have a correct CO2 ratio on the hemoglobin molecule as it circulates around the body in order for it to drop off oxygen. So hemoglobin, just briefly to understand this biochemistry, as blood cells go through the capillaries in the lung, they pick up oxygen and they drop off CO2. As they go into the tissues, they pick up CO2 and drop off oxygen. Now, nasal breathing makes all of this much more efficient compared to mouth breathing, and can condition the body faster in a sense. And so oftentimes when we're dealing with people who are just coming back from extreme stress, or who are having difficulty recovering from intense exercise, or for whom we don't know sort of the intensity of the exercise, we will oftentimes institute nasal breathing in that way, so that these individuals can not overreach or overtrain and be able to not get overly stressed. So heart rate recovery is a big one here. The ability to do nasal breathing is another one. And we now have heart rate variability. Now, there are many, many different tools. I use and love the Aura Ring. There's others. There's the Whoop. I believe Apple Watch even now is getting the ability to do HRV, and obviously can do heart rate recovery. The tech is becoming pretty spectacular here in terms of being able to tap into heart rate variability. Now, heart rate variability, or HRV, is different than heart rate recovery. Heart rate variability is the beat-to-beat difference in the way the heart beats. And so most people think the heart beats like a metronome, lub-dub, 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 in a very rhythmic and smooth way. But in fact, the heart beats more like a symphony. it beats faster and slower. So it's more like lub-dub, 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 right? So there's a cadence to it, a variation to it. And what we know is that the more varied the heart rate variability, right, the more varied that is, the healthier the heart. You do not want a static metronome type heartbeat. You want a varied heart rhythm in a sense. And so we can pick up HRV, and HRV tells us an awful lot about sympathetic parasympathetic balance. And it can be useful because oftentimes you will see perturbations or changes in HRV well before you start to feel differences in S.H.M.E.C and S.H.M.E.C. And so HRV is really, really powerful in this regard. You will also begin to see lots of other things that you can do. For example, with some of this tech, like the Aura Ring, for example, it will look at temperature changes. Your sleep temperature, your resting heart rate, your HRV, along with your recent activity, how intense it was, your accumulated activity over several days, and your sleep quality and quantity, and puts all this together in a readiness score, which is basically just like, hey, here's how ready we think you are based on all of these different biometrics that we are combining as a way to give you a brief insight into how much stress you might be under. Now combine that with S.H.M.E.C and S.H.M.E.C and paying close attention to your own biofeedback, and you have a really good way to begin measuring and dealing with stress. So this is what I want you to be thinking about. Now, one of the things that I'll do really quickly before we begin to wrap up is this idea that I often talk about rest-based living. One of the things we want to be thinking about when we think about stress, and now I'm talking about mainly stress that is negative stress, not eustress, is we want to do things that either create an adaptation response, things that stress us out for a short period of time but help our body be more resilient to stress later. These would be things like sauna, cold therapy, contrast therapy, enough but not too much exercise, enough but not too much food. These would be all of those kinds of things we want to do. And we also want to do things that are relaxing in their own right, that reduce cortisol. For example, creative pursuits reduce stress hormones. We know that. Coloring, writing, painting, doing sculpture, anything creative tends to do that. Reading, so long as it's not horror movies and things like that, can lower stress hormones. Laughter, massage and meditation, very gentle activities like Tai Chi or Yin type yoga or slow relaxing walking. These kinds of things. Time with pets, so long as they're not, peeing and pooping all over the place and stressing you out. Sex and physical affection and social connection and purpose. Purpose is a huge one because if you look at the research on purpose, which is not a lot of things, but people who are very purpose driven and have a strong why oftentimes tend to be very stress resilient. So there is a lot of perceived and perception based things going on with stress. But we want to be doing things that help us adapt. Short, intense exercise can do that, right? Or lower stress hormones in their own right. Things that I would call rest-based living. Sauna therapies, contrast hydrotherapies. These would be things, thermal challenges. These would be adaptation responses. But then add into that things like massage and meditation and spa therapies and things like that. These would be things that just relax us across the board. Most people are not thinking about these things. But if you take the metabolism as a stress barometer and you realize that the more the pressure builds up on that barometer, the more you're going to move from these different stages of metabolic compensation to metabolic resistance to metabolic dysfunction to metabolic disease and damage, the more you're going to also be dealing with things like increased hunger, energy, and cravings, which make you basically drive for more calories, sleep and mood going out of check. All of these things make it almost impossible for you to create a calorie deficit and to sustain that calorie deficit through hormonal balance. In other words, it makes it almost impossible for the metabolism to get back to homeostasis. And so you want to take this two-pronged approach. Adaptation signals that make you stronger. These would be short, intense bouts of stressful responses, thermal challenges in heat, thermal challenges in cold, thermal workout challenges and things like that. All of these things being adaptation signals, so long as they are in the Goldilocks zone, intense enough but not too intense, short-lived stresses. And then everything that will reduce the stress burden in general and lower cortisol levels is what you want to be thinking about as you deal with stress. Now, notice throughout this whole conversation, I mentioned emotional stress in a very little. But I do want to cover this for just a minute, because one of the things about emotional stress, and the Stoics have a lot to say on this. Stoic philosophy, one of the major things that they do is they teach you through a very simple method to take a lot of the stress off your system. And they do this through teaching about the three locuses of control. There are things that we control completely. There are things that we control only partly. And there are things that we do not control at all. And so the Stoics would say, give no emotional valence or no consideration to things you do not control at all. Just let those things go. Also, be very particular and perhaps try your best, even with things you only partially control, to not deal with those. The only things you really should be exerting any emotional angst over would be the things that you control completely. And when you get down to it, that is only really one thing. It's the way you think about the world, how you see the world. Marcus Aurelius, one of my favorite Stoics, has a quote, and he essentially says, if you do not feel injured, then you weren't injured, despite the fact that someone else might think you're injured. In other words, we have the ability, us humans, to simply decide not to feel slighted or not to feel stressed. We have a huge perception superpower. We can choose to see things differently. We can choose to play victim, or we can choose to use it. In fact, research on success tells us really that there's three things that most determines people's success. And it has nothing to do with IQ or social intelligence or anything like that. It has to do with three things primarily. Your belief in your own ability, the belief that your tribe has in you, and most importantly, your ability to see stress, fears, and failures as learning and growth enhancement opportunities rather than things that degrade you. And this takes a lot of some of the emotional angst and stress that we humans have. Now, of course, it's difficult, but it is very doable. And when you have individuals who are practicing this, now add purpose onto that, and you now have a very strong why to live for, as well as focusing on only the things you can control. And some of the emotional angst, anger, fear, and all this kind of stuff that a lot of people deal with begins to be less and less and less. And you begin to be able to be a far more emotionally stable and less emotionally reactive individual. And therefore, yes, begin to lower your metabolic stress as well. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is how we can begin to manage stress once we've gone too far. Now, one of the things that is beneficial, this is really a whole different topic, and I really should consider, and maybe I will do a follow-up of part 2 on this particular podcast. But I do want to mention that one of the things natural medicine is really good at that conventional medicine does not have is adaptogens. There are herbs and perhaps some supplements that act as adaptogens. What is an adaptogen? An adaptogen is something that helps the metabolism get back to balance. If function is too low, it will raise that balance. If function is too high, it will lower that balance. These adaptogens, things like rhodiola, things like eleutherococcus, things like holy basil, things like vitex, things like ashwagandha, all the different styles of ginsengs, maca, for example. All of these things act, and there is a whole bunch of them. Schizandra, Korean red ginseng. All of these things these herbs have adaptogenic action, and most of them are working on the hypothalamus and its connection to its ability to hear stress signals and signals coming from the body, and its ability to address and adapt itself to low function or high function. These adaptogens are absolutely critical, and they can do a lot to help the metabolism adapt and get better. And so I'm going to end the podcast there. Maybe I will pick up on this next time. I hope this gave you a lot to think about with the mechanisms of metabolic stress and how to deal with metabolic stress. And I will see you at the next episode.